The sun was setting behind the cityscape of London as Sarah Bennett sat alone in her small apartment, looking at the dozens of rejection emails that littered her inbox. With each message, a piece of her optimism seemed to fade away, like petals falling from a flower. She'd done everything right. Graduated top of her class in marketing, interned, built a solid resume. But here she was, month after month, finding herself unemployed and adrift in a city that seemed to have no place for her. Each email echoed the same lifeless response. Thank you for your interest, but we have decided to move forward with other candidates. It was like a loop, a message she'd almost memorized, and every time it felt more like a hammer chipping away at her self-worth. Sarah's dreams had always been big. She had a passion for storytelling, a talent for breathing life into brands, and a love for London's bustling streets. She'd moved to the city with visions of climbing the corporate ladder, of making her mark. And yet, here she was, waiting for someone to see her potential, for someone to take a chance. As she waited, Sarah sought refuge in the few places that brought her peace. Her favorite spot was a small cafe tucked in a quiet corner of Covent Garden, where she'd sip tea and write stories. It was her escape, a place where, for a few hours, she could forget the rejection letters and the voices of doubt around her. But the voices seemed to find her no matter where she hid. At home, her family's well-intentioned remarks had turned into sharp criticisms. Her mother, once her biggest supporter, had started to lose patience. "Sarah," she'd say, "your sister landed a job right out of university. What are you doing wrong?" The words cut deeper every time she heard them, as if each criticism carried the weight of her unfulfilled promises. Her father, though less blunt, often made painful comparisons. "Your brother's excelling in finance. Your sister's a great teacher. Have you thought about something more stable?" He didn't say it outright, but she knew what he meant, that maybe her dreams were just that, dreams. At first, Sarah tried to brush it off, assuring herself that they didn't understand her passion. But the doubt was spreading, like a dark cloud over her heart. Her husband, Tom, wasn't helping either. His patience had worn thin, and his words were laced with bitterness. "You're too slow, Sarah," he'd say. "Always lost in your head, thinking the world will reward you for daydreaming. What are you even contributing here?" On a cold winter evening, when the cupboards were bare, Sarah swallowed her pride and reached out to her brother. She dialed his number with trembling hands, her voice barely a whisper when he picked up. "Brother, can you lend me some money? I need to feed my children." The words stung as they left her lips, each one a reminder of how far she'd fallen from the life she'd envisioned. He hesitated, and she could feel his disappointment through the phone. But then, he sighed. "Okay, send me your account details, but Sarah, you need to find a way to support yourself. I can't be here forever." The shame of that call lingered long after she'd hung up. She promised herself she wouldn't call again, that somehow she'd make it on her own. With renewed determination, Sarah decided to channel her creativity into something tangible. She started an online shop selling handmade crafts and vintage items she sourced from second-hand stores. She poured herself into it, hoping it would be her ticket to independence. But reality hit hard. Sales were sporadic at best, the earnings barely enough to scrape by. Every morning, she'd log in to check if anyone, had bought something. The waiting continued. Then, after weeks of silence, an email arrived from a company she admired, a brand she'd dreamed of working for since her university days. They were offering her an interview. Sarah's heart raced as she reread the email, not daring to believe it was real. This was her chance, the break she'd been waiting for. The night before the interview, she couldn't sleep. Doubts gnawed at her, each one louder than the last. What if I don't get the job? What if I'm just not enough? She barely managed a few hours of sleep before the alarm jolted her awake. She dressed carefully, picking out her best outfit and trying to calm her nerves as she practiced her answers in front of the mirror. The interview, however, didn't go as planned. It was scheduled for an hour, but wrapped up in under 20 minutes. The interviewer's disinterest was palpable, and Sarah left the building feeling like an imposter. The sting of failure was almost too much to bear. She walked the London streets in a daze, the city's beauty lost on her in that moment of despair. I failed again, she thought, her heart sinking under the weight of her doubts. That night, when the company was supposed to call, she turned off her phone. She couldn't handle another rejection, not after she'd poured every last bit of herself into the interview. She sat in silence, staring at the blank wall, feeling the emptiness of her waiting period consume her. But then, something inside her stirred, a faint spark, a whisper that reminded her of who she was before the rejections, the criticism, the waiting. With trembling hands, she turned her phone back on later that night, half expecting another, unfortunately. But there was a voicemail. Heart pounding, she listened. The voice on the other end was warm, congratulatory. They were impressed by her candidness, her creativity, her vision. They wanted to offer her the position. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. This is real, she thought. The words like a balm to every wound, every harsh word, every moment of self-doubt. The waiting period wasn't forever. The next morning, as she sat on the bus to her new job, Sarah looked out at the city with fresh eyes. The waiting period had not broken her. It had forged her. She realized that every rejection, every difficult conversation, and every moment of self-doubt had prepared her for this role. The city was no longer just a backdrop. It was the place that had tested her, pushed her, and finally rewarded her perseverance. In her new position, she found a renewed sense of purpose. Her writing, which had once been an escape, became a celebrated part of her work. And every day she carried with her the lesson that her worth was never in the hands of others. It was in her resilience, her courage, her determination. The waiting period was over, and as she walked confidently into the future she'd fought so hard for, she knew one thing for sure. She would never let anyone, not even herself, define her limits again.